In the religious view, obviously, there are certain things that I believe are capable of understanding by any sentient human being. So I don't believe that all human beings in the absence of religion are immoral people who go around murdering their neighbors and raping their sisters. I think and in fact, this is pretty well embedded in even Judaic philosophy, the idea that there is a sort of natural law theology where you as just a normal person know not to kill people and know not to steal and know to set up courts of law. This is what they call the seven commandments to Noah. But the idea is that anyone can basically discover these things. And there are universals across culture about you're not.
Do we just discover them, or they were revealed to us by God in the Bible, and that makes it incumbent upon us?
Supposed to murder your brother. But the biblical reading is that to reach a more sophisticated level of morality that leads to a sort of right-based society we see here, you at least need the catalyzing enzyme of a Judeo-Christian religion in order to get here. That would, I think, be the most rationalistic argument on behalf of Judeo-Christian values.
But where is here again?
Here would be a civilization that values individual rights above the values of the collective, that says that people are to be treated, to use the biblical phrase, as made in the image of God, that we should treat individuals as made in the image of God. That does not happen in the absence of a Judeo-Christian value system. That's the religious argument. Although that is more of a historical argument. Right. That's what I'm saying. It's a rationalistic argument, because the deeply religious argument would be God said so do it, right? But that's not the argument that I think is the most compelling, because that only works if you believe in God and if you believe in.
Well, if you don't believe in God, then morality is going to be whatever you choose to be morality. And that's why the envelope is pushed so far, because there is no belief. So there is no consensus, and without a notion of God, and based in some text, or better yet, in Revelation at Sinai.
Revelation. So that's not the argument that I tend to make, because I don't find it intellectually convincing. It's an argument from authority, which of course is not particularly convincing. So I tend to make the historical argument, which is that history brought us to, that the reason we are at this point in history is because without that particular catalyzing enzyme, you don't get what you have here, which is why the West and Western civilization crop up in a Judeo-Christian system, but don't crop up in, for example, Islamic countries.
That's pretty circular reasoning, is what the result is. That's going to prove that Judeo-Christian has value, which on one hand, that's true, but perhaps the real truth is that there is historical evidence to the fact that there were people that were spoken to at Mount Sinai, 2.5 million people, who gave the same story over to their children and children's children, unbroken until this very day. That's historical proof. Just like we know with a certainty that Abraham Lincoln was assassinated, even though we weren't there. There's no coverage on the news about it, but we know it because it's a oral historical truth, just as the giving of the Torah and Mount Sinai is an oral historical truth. And that is, therefore, evidence.
And Islam's been around for 1,000 years. So number one, what do you make of that argument? And then I want to get into, so where you think morality comes from.
Right. Well, a few points. One, I'm not convinced by that historical argument. I think you can cherry pick the data either way and come up with a different conclusion. And even if I agreed with it, it wouldn't make the case I think you want to make, because it would be an instance of what's called the genetic fallacy, which is even if we granted that our respect for individual rights, say, came from a Judeo-Christian tradition, it doesn't mean that it can only come from there, or that it even is best gotten from there. And I would say that it actually hasn't come principally from there. And there are many ways. So, for instance, you could say that Christianity, in particular, was in part responsible for the fall of the Roman Empire. Right. So Christianity undermined the notion that the Roman emperor was a god. You know, it made it harder to recruit true soldiers, and they had to farm it out to mercenaries. And it eroded what you might call traditional Roman values. And then the Western Empire fell, and we ushered in the Dark Ages. And insofar as there was a reboot to civilization at that point, it was largely the result of classical, the learning and philosophical insight of antiquity being preserved by, of all people, the
in the Islamic world, right?
So I think you can have it any way you want looking at history, but it just doesn't get you there in terms of the moral content and in this case, the political or social content coming from the Bible or any other religious text.
So then why here? Meaning, like, why in Judeo-Christian civilization, but not Islamic civilization? Because you mentioned rediscovery of Aristotle and reuse of Aristotle in 10th and 11th centuries was really beginning, in the Islamic world long before Aquinas really repopularized it in the 13th and 14th centuries.
Yeah. Well, one, I think it's, from my point of view, it's impossible to ignore the influence of Islam. I mean, Islam is its own ideology and set of dogmatisms that are inflexible and at odds with the spirit of science fundamentally. And despite the fact that there was a brief period where there seemed to be some, happy convergence between scientific and mathematical insight and Islam, for the most part, Islam has been hostile to, a real intellectual life, and in a way that Christianity was hostile, even when the scientific worldview was struggling to be born in the 16th century and the 15th century. What we have historically is a real war of ideas, and I mean, just it can be crystallized in the moment where Galileo was shown the instruments of torture and put under house arrest by people who refused to look through his telescope. Right? I mean, so that was the genius of religion paired with the emerging genius of science in that room.
Well, to be fair, I mean, Galileo was originally sponsored by the church, and so is Copernicus. But there's no question there's a backlash from the church to this stuff.
Yes, and the backlash makes sense because there is a intellectual progress on questions of how the cosmos is organized or where it came from or how life began. All of these questions are the scientific answers to which are in zero-sum contest with the doctrines found in the books. Now, it's true that there are religious people, and now even the Pope, who have relaxed.
I wouldn't say that from a Jewish perspective. Whatever seems to be a contradiction in the world of science ultimately can be answered in Jewish texts and Jewish learning. Jewish learning, on one hand, like the Ten Commandments, is carved in stone. But on the other hand, it's also ever expanding and ever growing in its depth of understanding. And hence, we have commentators today that have added on, although they might be midgets, but they're standing on the shoulders of giants. And when you are a midget standing on the shoulder of a giant, you can see further and more deeply. And therefore, on one hand, yes, carved in stone. On the other hand, it's forever progressing and getting deeper, the teachings of the Torah. And hence, they're not a contradiction, as might be suggested, the scientific world and the world of Torah. Not at all.
Their adherence to tradition enough to make room for something like evolution, right? But it is still a problem.
Not a super new idea. I mean, right? Aquinas was talking about this in the 13th century and 14th century. The idea that if it was in science and it was contradicted by the book, then you're misreading the book, right? I mean, that's a pretty old idea.
But that is to subvert science rather than the book in Aquinas' case. I mean, Aquinas thought heretics should be put to death, right? His argument for capital punishment for heresy. And Augustine made the same argument. Augustine thought they should be tortured, right? So that those two great lights of the Catholic Church gave us the Inquisition and gave us more than a century.
I think it's also fair to say that they were rather instrumental in the development of modern science. So the Dark Ages, first of all, I think the Dark Ages are a bit of an exaggeration in terms of the Dark Ages themselves saw a massive growth in technology and architecture, for example. I mean, Gothic cathedrals are built during the Dark Ages. But, but the scientific world is, well, virtually every major university in the Western world was sponsored by the Catholic Church. And I'm not a great Catholic defender, right? But virtually all major universities were sponsored by the Catholic Church, which saw consonance between science and religion as a reason to actually investigate the natural world. set up courts of law. This is what they call the seven.
He may be not a defender, seemingly, but he is definitely not giving the Jewish perspective on Judaism and how we deal with morality. Look at morality when it comes from the world of intellect. What greater intellects were there 80 years ago, but in Germany? And yet they became the most depraved nation of history, the Nazis, and what they did, not just to 6 million Jews, but throughout the world. And that was all based on intellect rather than a firm belief and faith in something that's greater than ourselves, that we give ourselves over to the Word of God as it is in the Torah.
The scientific world is, well, virtually every major university in the Western world was sponsored by the Catholic Church. And I'm not a great Catholic defender, right? But virtually all major universities were sponsored by the Catholic Church, which saw consonance between science and religion as a reason to actually investigate the natural world.
Well, no, I mean, I think that's backwards. I think the reality is there was everything that was good that was done anywhere at any time prior to, pick your year, was done by some religious person. I mean, there was just nobody else to do the job, right? So you could make the argument that, Catholics built every bridge in Europe until the Protestants came around and they built their half of the bridges. I mean, so there was just no one else to do the job. And we're human beings who want to pursue various ends, many of which require breakthroughs in learning. So, engineering got born in a religious context. Physics was, the first physicists were people who were Christians, who were, we had, as is often pointed out, Newton spent half his time worrying about biblical prophecy. Now, I think that was an objective waste of his time. He also spent a lot of his time worrying about astrology, right? So you're trying to
alchemy,
yes, and alchemy, and alchemy, insofar as there was anything to it, apart from sort of the internal myth-making that may be of use to some people, edged into chemistry, right? So there was often a real science at the back of a lot of merely mortal confusion where people were trying to work things out. I would argue very much under the shadow of religious commitments that they need not have had and were not actually serving their ultimate ends. And this for me is true in the moral sphere as well, because this is why the Bible, in my view, can't be the real repository of our moral wisdom in any sense, because when you go to read it, you are forced to ignore certain passages or reinterpret them rather aggressively to conform to what you now in the 21st century have every reason to believe is good or a direction worth going socially. So,
Well, Sam, I would suggest come and learn some Torah, and you will see that if you learn not the words merely of the Bible, of the 5 books of Moses, which on its own is not to be understood without the oral tradition, then you will misinterpret even something simple as slavery. Slavery was actually a gift back in the day, that if you didn't own the shirt on your back, that was the only time that you could sell yourself into slavery. The only other time slavery was applicable was if you were a thief and you couldn't pay back what you stole, then you were sold into slavery, and with the funds reimbursed to the person who was stolen from. But that's not the reading you're going to get when you look at the 5 books of Moses, because it is shorthand, very condensed. It needs to be elongated with the tradition, the oral tradition, to give us a true understanding. So I invite you to come and join and learn these deeper, or the truth, even about a simple thing like slavery.
It is just an inconvenient fact that slavery is endorsed in the Bible. It's explicitly endorsed in the Old Testament, and it's certainly not repudiated in the New, right? And Jesus told slaves to serve their masters and to serve their Christian masters especially well. So there's no place in the Bible where you can get a truly compelling case against slavery because the creator of the universe clearly expected slavery to be a human institution.
Well, except for abolitionists finding enough inspiration in the Bible to use it as their main text.
But they did that despite what's in the Bible.
Well, I think that is, I mean, I don't want to, this shouldn't sound insulting because it's not meant as an insult. I think that from a religious point of view, that's a simplistic reading of the Bible's role in human affairs, meaning that when any written document is given to any group of people, it has to be given to people in a way that they can understand. It's not that slavery was endorsed by the Bible. It's that slavery is universal among human civilization until modern times.
But it was, no. There are religions that have different points of view on all these questions, right? So it was possible in the 5th century BC to have a take on ethics with respect to something like slavery or the killing of combatants or non-combatants. That was quite a bit more modern and ethical and civilized than is found in the Bible. So I mean, you might not like some of their other commitments, but take something like Jainism, right? I mean, Jainism, Gandhi got his nonviolence from Jainism. I mean, Jainism is just, in truth, a religion of peace, unlike Islam, which is the word peace is a euphemism for the word surrender there, or submission. So it's possible for people 2,500 years ago to wake up one day and even write a book which suggests don't harm anyone or anything, even a cricket.
Right. Well, that's fine. But the question is, how many converts does Jainism have? Meaning that the point of, if you're going to give a book over, let's pretend that you thought that God existed and that you were He. And it was your job to convey to a group of human beings what you think morality should be, understanding that they're going to take that and develop that because we do have this gift of human reason that we use to develop things. And so there's a root text, and then it is developed over time. This is why I think Judaism is particularly kind of unique in this respect, because that's been an ongoing dialectic for literally thousands of years. I mean, there's legitimately thousands of pages of tractates of just people arguing about these particular issues. You would say that the argument should have started from the point of there was no text for them to argue about, and they should have just argued from sort of a priori reason, maybe.
No, I mean, I respect text, but I think the principle of revelation is a problem. But just to back up for a second, I think it's certainly problematic for you as a Jew to argue that the legitimacy or success of a religion is best measured by the number of adherents in the year 2018. Right?
No, but the point of...
Very true. We only have 14 million adherents, 0.2% of the world population. But the truth is, one of the proofs is, for the historical truth of the Torah, is the fact that the Jewish people are still here. Not only they're here, but are Am Yisrael Chai in a very real manner, making a great impact in the world. Sometimes a negative impact, but for the most part, a very positive impact. And that itself is an evidence of the eternity of the Jewish people and the Jewish message that is in the Torah.
Judaism also is that it says in the Bible itself that God is going to make, great peoples of all of Abraham's sons, for example. And as Maimonides put it in the Jewish belief, even the growth of Islam and Christianity, which are obviously based on a certain Judaic root. I think Islam less so, because there's an actual rewriting of the Old Testament, and the New Testament not as much. Maimonides suggested that Christianity had basically been brought about as an extension of Judaism, which is the greatest, Christianity is the greatest converting religion in the history of the world.
Right. So but it seems strange to count at the success in terms of numbers of Christianity and Islam, given that the
basic principle. The bottom line is the basic principles of Judaism. Those have been embraced in a way that the basic principles of Jainism have not across time, and they've shaped civilizations in a way that is significantly better than the principles of Jainism have shifted any number of small people, or a small group of people.
All right. What can I say? Both of them could use a real good dose of Torah learning from the original text, and with the oral tradition, the arguments back and forth between the sages, and most importantly, that when you approach something, approach it without preconceived notions, objectively. And I suggest that there'll be a great turnaround and an appreciation for what I don't call the Bible, but the world calls the Bible, but for the Torah.